Can we start?
Wait, it's still connecting to YouTube. Okay.
Okay, we can start, right?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Febriana Firdaus, the managing editor of the Environmental Reporting Collective. So you are here in our live stream discussion on the global sand mining, discussion on our latest global collaborations beneath the sands. So it's I will give you a little bit background about our project ERC and our project. So ERC is a group of group or the network of the journalists and newsroom that dedicate themselves to investigate environmental crimes around the world. And we founded in 2008 when during the event of the Uncovering Asia, supported by the Global Investigative Journalism Network. Our first investigation was Pangolin reports in 2019, and then Ocean in 2020, and in this year we launched investigation titled Beneath the Sand. So it's story about the impact of the global sand mining business around the world. Yeah, global sand mining business. Okay, so so why we decide to investigate the sand mining business around the world? So it started in June 2022 when we had our global convening. So it's a convening, it's our annual events to gather ideas about what we should to investigate this year, like the upcoming year. So we invite not only journalists, but also academicians and environmentalists. So that when we got an idea, the initial idea is to investigate about reclamation. But then we did this full research on it, and we conclude that there is a bigger problem than just reclamation. It is actually the global sand mining itself. So as you know that sand is the second most used resource on earth after water, and it consumed within the country, and there is no institution that monitors sand. So we cannot measure actually how the volume of the sand that we use around the globe, because it's very hard. It's consumed within countries. So we are going to go deep dive on that. So I will introduce first my team here. So everyone, can you introduce yourself first, and then we can start with the discussion. Start from Paritta, maybe.
Hi everyone, my name is Paritta. I'm an editor from Mekong Eye, which is an environmental news website focusing on environmental issues in the Mekong region.
Yeah, and then next, Lam.
What to Lam?
Hi, so my name is Lam, and I'm also an editor at Mekong Eye, and my focus is on Vietnam.
Okay, Krisna.
Hi everyone, I'm Pradipta. I'm digital producer from Tempo, a national magazine in Indonesia.
Yeah, Nabilah, please.
Hi, I'm Nabilah Said. I'm the editorial lead at Continentalist. We're a data-driven editorial studio based outside of Singapore, and we cover various topics for social impact.
Okay, and then Shamsheer.
Hi everybody. I'm Shamsheer Yousaf. I'm an independent journalist from India, and I cover a lot of stories on environment.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I think we can, as I told you before, that the initial idea is to investigate reclamation. So I think I want to give the first chance to Krisna and Nabilah, because they're the one who like work on that story, on that angle, please.
Yeah, cool. I think I'll start and then we'll go to what Nabilah covered in Singapore first. So reclamation is kind of like one of the big sand guzzlers in terms of consumption within the sand mining industry, right? The sand industry is used for everything, right? Computers, consumer electronics, construction. But if we're talking, the focus on reclamation is because sand is actually, as it is, sand as a material without being processed, without being anything, is a key ingredient to reclamation. And reclamation always needs it in terms of, millions of cubic meters in volume. So it's because of that, we decided pretty early on, the ERC's reclamation team is myself, Keng Sir, who's not here. He's the data lead for the ERC as well, and Nabilah. We decided pretty early on in a meeting that it's going to be a data-led story, highlighting how countries all over the world use reclamation. So as we approached it through like the data-driven reporting lens, we found several research papers authored by researchers mostly from universities in the UK and the US who've been tracking reclamation projects all over the world. Kang reached out to these researchers and they shared with him more detailed data and map files for each reclamation projects. So, and then we used Mapbox, Leaflet, and Waypoint to create like a storytelling experience for the readers to kind of see expansions from each nations. So we'll have a link to each of the papers for credit purposes in the YouTube maybe later. But yeah, so later, just talking about reporting now, key findings from our report is that we found that there is a transition on the purpose of reclamation lately. So earlier on, like we're talking 1970s, like even as far back as the 1800s, I think, reclamation was used for expansions to reclaim parts of the country previously thought to be unusable. So it's in the name, right? Reclamation. So we're thinking about the Netherlands, who there's a saying that the Netherlands people have. God put the Dutch there, but the Dutch built the Netherlands. This is because the Netherlands used to be a swamp area, and they would reclaim those areas using traditional polder methods. So they would drain the water. They would create seawalls, and then they would drain the area, and then they would construct there. So these are like the very early examples of reclamation. And then it transitions to kind of like, we're talking about the early 2010s with luxury projects that are like the, how Dubai did it with Palm Jumeirah. So it's like huge construction projects with like really interesting shapes made for tourism purposes, and or getting all the expats who live there living in like not a desert sandstorm island, but like in a more beach kind of environment. And now what we're finding is that governments are now trying to justify reclamation as a proper climate defense strategy, right? We found that governments all over the world are saying that like due to population explosion and climate change, reclamation is actually needed. So we saw Denmark's Lynetteholm project, Nigeria's Eco-Atlantic, and the Maldives atoll reclamation. So these three come to mind. Each of these put artificial land as climate defense strategies, but unlike there's not a lot of people know that it is in exchange with massive environmental considerations, right? Lynetteholm in Denmark, their project, which is like a massive seawall that they said that would protect them from protect Copenhagen from ocean surges would threaten to desalinate the Baltic Seas. So that's like 8 other countries that might be affected with that project, right? The Eco-Atlantic was alleged to have caused ocean surges in other parts of Nigeria that led to people being killed. So, and then this I haven't even gone to the cost of the sand of these projects, right? Sourcing countries like Indonesia, like people are being displaced. People are really feeling the environmental effects of sand mining. So reclamation projects takes like huge amounts of sand, marine sand from other countries. So countries that don't have a sand source usually import it from other countries, like Indonesia. And then we found that like, people's livelihoods are being threatened, islands are disappearing. So that's also the cost of it. But we're being realistic, right? Reclamation does have a good kind of sound to it when governments say that like, oh, we need it for climate defense, because it is right. Like lands are sinking, like Jakarta is sinking like how many centimeters a year I think the UN published a report that said, the IPCC published a report that said that in 2100, the Maldives would be gone. So what we're saying is that if the government is super serious about it, this is the cost, right? And the cost is too high. So it has to be like, if reclamation is a real thing, is a real project that people need for climate consideration, it has to be built on something better than sand. So with that, like, I'm gonna shift to Nabilah, who's gonna talk to us about how Singapore uses reclamation and kind of get into deep with the sand cost of it all. So over to you, Nabilah.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think the thing about the Singapore story with sand is from the start, coming into this project, a lot of people were already like almost knowing what the story is with Singapore. Basically, oh, sand guzzler, like kind of almost like I could imagine the finger pointing already, like, oh, Singapore's the big like villain in like sucking sand from our neighbors and then like putting it God knows where, right? And I think the glamorous story is the ironic story, which is Singapore is so small. The whole idea of like, we are a little red dot, so how can we be a sand guzzler? There's almost like an impossibility in that story. And with this story, like I racked my brain to find like what is a new thing to say if everyone already knows that Singapore is one of the biggest importers of sand, and we already know that like Singapore is a big, like reclaims a lot. So I think I just wanted to initially like clarify what that story was. So one of the first things we did, or well, not one of the first things, because it took really long, was to just figure out like how many reclamation projects have been done in Singapore, and like when did it start, and did it always start with importing sand? And actually the answer is, it started with as a lot of stories start, it starts with like colonialism and how like, the engineers from like the British times already started reclaiming parts of Singapore for developmental reasons, right? And obviously like to enrich like the kingdom of like Britain, or the queendom, I think at that time. And at that time it wasn't with imported sand, it was with sand that was from Singapore itself. So like our hills were being leveled, our rivers were being like excavated, the sand was taken from like our own coasts in Singapore. And at some point, obviously you run out of sand, because yes, Singapore is small. And that's where we started to import sand from overseas. But in terms of the story that we were telling ourselves internally, like the reclamation projects and all were still being justified, and it never stopped. So I think when we were collecting the number of projects, it was about, 50 to 60. So like from before 1957 to now, in fact, like we have a lot of future reclamation projects in the pipeline. And if you just like map that out, you already get a sense of like, wow, like even though we are like a little red dot, we've expanded, like, I think by 20%. And that's like a tangible way to think about where has sand gone, and like what of modern Singapore is made of reclaimed land, and the answer is 20%, right? So quantifying it was already useful, because I think it's less useful to kind of like point a finger at Singapore. It's more useful to be like, to put things into like hard numbers. Yeah. Obviously, because we're data driven, so we try to follow like where the data leads us. Then I think the other story that we wanted to tell is a lot of the other newsrooms around us, like, were doing like really hard-hitting investigative journalism about like the scale of loss that was happening around us. And I think that's really, really important. And obviously, like in Singapore, we can't replicate that journalism happening in our neighboring countries. But I also wanted to document the loss that was happening in Singapore as well. So for example, like we've lost like 95% of our coral reefs have been lost. I've heard, I mean, this wasn't in my story, but I've heard that Singapore's beaches and water used to be like beautiful with like amazing coral, like really, really awesome, coastal ecosystems. And now, I don't even like swim in the beach because it's supposedly like, polluted, and there's like apparently like fecal matter in some of our waters and things. And even things like that, you already get a sense of the loss isn't even that far away. It's not even only in our neighboring countries. It's like the loss is in our own backyard, right? It's in our own like coast. So I wanted to move the scale of loss closer to a regular Singaporean, and to not see it as like, oh, it's a faraway problem. Yeah, sand mining, I kind of know about it, but Singapore, we need to reclaim land, because that's the narrative. So we wanted to complexify that narrative a bit more, just because in Singapore, like a lot of our narratives of like success is related to development. And if that story of development is made a bit more complex, is made a bit more relatable to even an everyday Singaporean, and to make them feel that loss, that it's closer to them, then, hopefully that helps to like move the needle. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nabilah. So everyone's like who watched this YouTube live stream can ask question later if you want to go deep dive on reclamation angle in Singapore, especially. So I want to move to the Mekong region. It's very like the most popular story we ever heard about sand mining. It's about the soil or erosion of the Mekong region river bank, sorry. So that's like all the story about sand mining. So I want to ask Paritta and Lam here. So I was so excited when found this new platform, environmental website, independent environmental website in a Mekong region, Mekong Eye, because they work closely with the local journalists who didn't even speak English or like write in English, but they have like great editor. Here's like Paritta and Lam, who help these local journalists to tell the story from the region. We believe that by working with them, we can get like a deep dive, like more specific story and finding, and of course, like to make sure we tell the whole story from the region. So I will give a chance to Paritta to explain what is like the situation in Mekong region. And they also publish a spirit story in their website titled Thirst of Sand. You can visit Mekong Eye website. And let's hear from Paritta and Lam. Paritta and Lam, please.
Yeah, I will start first, and thank Febriana for spelling our website very hard. Before I talk more about the impact, let me give you the context of our region first. When we are looking for the story for sand mining, we kind of like struggle a little bit, at least me, because 10 years ago, a lot of reports mentioned about sand being exported from our region to somewhere else like Singapore, and that's kind of a very popular angle, among the international media. And yeah, it's really interesting, and we kind of like, should we do that again? And the answer is no, after we talk to the local journalists, because the context today in the Mekong region is really, really different from 10 years ago. So right now, like, we have like higher domestic demand for sand, because in the past 10 years, our regions also grow up quickly in terms of GDP. And also construction boom, and our region need a lot of infrastructure projects to grow the economy. So so clearly, sand in this region, is not for foreign countries anymore today. It's more for the region itself. And actually, that's the angle that we stick with in this project. And that's also something that could answer why the erosions do happen, even, countries like Cambodia or Vietnam banned sand export, a few years ago. That's because sand mining is still going on, and the sand is going to feed the local market. And I also have to give you a bit of context about our region. Our story focus on sand mining in the Mekong River in particular. And that's quite unique, because like Mekong River is shared by 6 countries in the Mekong region, and also China. And when the sand is taken away from the upstream countries, it apparently cause some impact on the countries in downstream countries, and it like sand mining becomes like a regional problem, not just a national problems anymore. And another problem is that even it's supposed to be the regional problems, we also lack access to data from each country to understand more about the volume of sand being taken, and also about the scale of the impact, particularly the transboundary impact across the country. But even we lack of that data, the thing is that when we ask journalists from different countries in this project, 3 countries from Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia, to work on the story, at least all of them, witness the impact, particularly erosion in every country that we work on the story. And that's proof a lot that, the impact of sand mining could be very large, even we don't have data back up. What we learn from our reporters is that, a lot of people along the river bank of the Mekong River lost their houses, and also their fortune, like lost their business. And also, for example, like in Cambodia, our reporter even dived down, to find out what is the chain impact of one, riverbank collapse incident, for example. And that kind of, make the whole family collapse, because they lost everything, and even lost, educational opportunity after the incident. So actually the impact is quite serious from what we found. And also it's not just the erosion, I think it's also a lot of problems like the hydraulic flow. We didn't really focus on this that much, but that is something that some academics talk about. Like if you take a lot of sand from the river, you reduce the volume of sediment, and that could change, the hydraulic flow of the river, and could like affect ecological system of the river, and affect the downstream countries somehow. It also could affect like saline intrusion, which is quite a serious problem in Vietnam. And also, of course, it's also, make the habitat loss. So there are a lot of problems, and to be honest, we couldn't prove that out, but at least for the erosion, we could hear from the local communities that really happened. And most of them link this incident to sand mining. I guess, you know, it's, well, from the journalistic point of view, it wouldn't be easy to link one incident to another, right? But because we don't have enough data and our governance is really poor. So, you know, whenever the local community see the sand miners in the river and they suddenly, you know, connect it to their loss, because there is no other data, you know, point out whether there are any factors. So yeah, that's pretty much everything that we found. And I think I can like move forward to Lam to focus on Vietnam, which is a country with significant impact, you know, from sand mining.
Thank you, Paritta. And I think you gave a great overview and made my job easier. And so Vietnam is quite kind of like a uniquely placed country in the Mekong region when it comes to impacts of sand mining, because it's the downstream country. So it's like especially the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. This is like the last point before the Mekong River enters the sea. And because of that, like sand mining activities upstream in Cambodia, Thailand, can affect, will basically and do affect how much sand reaches Vietnam. And because of that, this means that there's less and less sand every year to make the embankments strong and to keep like the Mekong Delta from sinking. But because of this excessive sand mining upstream and also in the Mekong Delta itself, then over the past few years, erosion, land subsidence has been a serious issue in the Mekong Delta. Thousands of people have lost homes, and thousands of people have lost their like farmland because of erosion. And of course, this erosion is not only caused by sand mining. There are other reasons for erosion too. Another one being sediment being trapped in hydropower dams upstream that are being built, that have been built and are continue to being built upstream in countries like China, Laos, and especially Laos recently, because Laos is aiming to become the battery of Southeast Asia. And these dams, they trap sediment, and sediment includes sand as well. So with sand mining and sediment being trapped upstream, we see the results in basically houses like collapsing within like sometimes in just like a minute or even within just seconds. And I mean, if you go to our website or to the Beneath the Sands website, and you can see like some of the videos shot by locals who were there, and of basically houses just collapsing, like I don't know, like dominoes or like carts and like house of cards, and then people lose homes, people lose livelihoods, but then sand mining continues because, as Paritta mentioned, many the countries in the Mekong regions, including Vietnam, are undergoing like this construction boom. A lot of like infrastructure is needed to be built, including roads, expressways, and for that, what Vietnam needs is sand. And Vietnam itself has already banned exports of sand a few years, like in 2017. And still, it seems that just the demand is so strong that like illegal sand mining is rampant in the region. And with illegal sand mining, I mean, if it's illegal, it's really hard to control. So we don't have data on how much sand is actually being scooped out of the Mekong Delta. But if you just look at the devastation of houses, like I think 20,000 houses have already been lost, been like collapsed. So if you just look at this number, you can kind of like imagine how much sand is being taken away from the delta. And I mean, currently Vietnam is trying to look into ways to find like sand alternatives, but no like viable solution has kind of like come out of this yet. And as long as this issue is not resolved, then sand mining is likely to continue. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paritta and Lam. Before we move to India, I just want to give a little bit background about the overall finding of our global collaboration beneath the sands on environmental impact angle. So it's going to be good to discuss with India after this. So unfortunately, Taiwan is not here, but we have Indonesia here. So first, like we look at this environmental impact feels like so far away in the oceans. So at first, like sand mining activities destroy the fishing grounds in some country that we report, and it's affected the catch, the volume of the catch of the fishermen in the region. For example, in Indonesia, in Taiwan, and even in Philippines, we can go back to Krisna after this a little bit, but and then the sand mining activity move, of course, to the land, right? After they massively extractive sand from the ocean, and then they also like they also dig up the land, dig up the sand in the like the coastal. So it's in the village, like for example, the story from Kenya and India. Some of these farmlands turns into sand harvesting sites. So this is what we got with the finding from our global collaboration. And then the impact feels like very close at home, as presented by Mekong I team, that it collapsed homes and also like nearby farmland. So it feels like very close to the impact, like very close to the home. So I think like I want to go to Krishna first in Indonesia, and then we can move to Shamsheer in India. So Krishna, can you tell the story about how like the sand mining activities in Rio Island impacted the local fishing industry in Indonesia?
Sure. So just a brief primer about Indonesia. We're as a archipelago, like a collection of islands becoming a nation, we are kind of the prime area for sand mining, because usually for sand mining and construction and reclamation purposes for all sorts of things, you need marine sand, right? Beach sand. And we have a lot of islands. So a lot of dredging companies come to Indonesia to source sand for countries that run out of sand, like Singapore or Dubai. You know, there are countries that are like this who source sand from Indonesia. What's happening in Riau right now is, so in just a really quick timeline, early 2000s, there was research that came out from the government that said Indonesia is losing a lot of islands due to unregulated sand mining, right? These are not, by losing islands, I don't mean like, oh, it becomes kind of uninhabitable because it's kind of drowned. We're losing islands as in it disappears from the area, right? And then that resulted in a moratorium from the government on sand mining. And yet, fast forward to 2023, and a bunch of other regulations have propped up. So Indonesia is weird because we have the regulations to kind of protect islands from sand mining, but because the regulations are kind of like all over the place, different ministries can't enforce it correctly. So what happens is that there's a deadlock in terms of enforcement, and companies using, what do you call it, permits from pre-2000s. So we're talking about in Riau, one of the companies that we investigated had a permit from 1999 that they used until now. Ends up still buying into the sand from all over the place. One of the most surprising things that we found in terms of environmental impacts in specific to Indonesia was the term loss of fishing production is bandied around, and it's usually a number, right? Projecting, like when I was doing reclamation, I saw like, oh, there's a projection that fishermen would use X amount of tons a year in fishing production. But what that number doesn't tell you is that the loss of a fishing area impacts culture, right? When we were talking to fishermen who were fishing in Riau and other places, they were talking about like this fishing ground has been given to us from our forefathers. So it was a culture. It's a way of life, right? It's a whole entire community built around that fishing ground. And when that fishing ground disappears because of, capitalistic tendencies to mine sand, that entire community disappears as well. When I was talking to fishermen, they were saying that they can't envision a future where their kids would be able to do the same thing as them. They would have to move, right? They would have to create another source of living. That's from Riau. Talk to the same kind of people in Jakarta, with the Jakarta Bay reclamation plans back then, and they were saying the same things. They were thinking about being wage laborers, completely divesting themselves from their way of life, from their culture. And this is because, sand mines, they're literally destroying and kind of like making these cultures and these kinds of communities disappear off the face of the earth. So that's one of the big, huge findings that we found in Indonesia in terms of environmental impacts as a sourcing country.
Okay, thank you, Krisna. That's a great explanation from Indonesia. So I think we can move to India right now. We have an independent journalist, Shamsheer Yousaf here. Hi, Shamsheer. So just a background that Shamsheer is working together with Monica Ja, but she's not here, but she will appear in another discussion for gender angles. So make sure you attend that one too. So Shamsheer, can you tell a little bit about the situation in India and how, like I said before, it's not only that the sand mining activities destroy the fishing grounds, which impacted the local fishing industry and reduce the catch, but also like turn farmland into the sand harvesting site. Can you tell like what is unique and different from the story from India?
Thanks, Febriana. Yes. So our primary, story was looking at farmland, particularly sand mining that was happening on farmland, and in particular, we were looking at one region of India in the north, the state of Bihar, which was infamous for violence around sand mining, and which Monica will be talking about, in the coming week. And what we wanted to do with this story was, sort of look at what are the sort of reasons behind this violence, why was this conflict, and what we could clearly see was that caste was, sort of the driving force, in this conflict. In India, the caste system, where historically one group of people, dominated another group, it plays a huge role in illegal sand mining. In the caste hierarchy, those in the lowest, who are called Dalits, they were treated as untouchables. Higher castes would not dine with them, would not marry. Land ownership also ran along these lines. So what happened was that, post-independence, in after 1947, government started offering land to these Dalits. And typically this land was, land that was available close to the river banks. It was essentially flooded like most of the year, but then for a short period, it rises above the water, and that land is extremely fertile. just throw a few seeds in the air, and then within a few months you'll have a full harvest. Unfortunately, this is also land which is great for sand. And what's happened is that since sand mining sort of picked up in the last 2 decades, this land has now been is being eyed by upper caste groups, essentially gangs, because they want to access this sort of valuable resource. And what we see is that violence has increased substantially. Dalits are sort of being alienated from their land, which they use as for farming. And Bihar especially is a state which is infamous for its massacres. Upper caste militias have murdered hundreds of lower castes in massacres. And so what this leaves is that the Dalits are left in a very tough situation. What do you do? I mean, so there are essentially 2 paths they have. One is that they compromise with these upper caste gangs. They get paid some, a small amount initially, where, they given a share of the profits, or maybe they even take part in the operations themselves. But then, slowly they're sort of sidelined, and then they're completely cut off from that land. The second option is, you approach a rival gang, but there again, the same thing happens. The rival gang may take over the land, give you a share initially, and then again they you lose access to this land. So we interviewed a bunch of people, and where we sort of, in our stories on the ERC website, and also our upcoming story, where we have a lot of cases of these people who remained landless for generations, and then were given land by the government, and now they don't have access to that land again. We also have a case where, it's not just farmland that is, that these communities are being alienated from. Even their homes are under threat. In one case, which we made a video story of, a village where 120 families were given land to build their homes along the banks of a river. And these communities have had to, battle with these sand mining mafias, because the sand mining is now happening right next to their house. And so they're not just, battling, for farmland, but also for their own homes. And and then of course the next sort of stage is politics. In a lot of these cases, what happens is those in these gangs enter local politics. They become MLAs. They become members of the legislative assemblies. They become members of parliament, and this sort of cycle then continues even more viciously. We have a lot of cases where sand mining members of the parliament and assemblies have been arrested, and these are all they all come from a particular upper caste communities, and so it becomes even more challenging for lower caste to challenge them in these situations. Yeah, thanks, Febriana.
Okay, thank you, Shamsheer. So when the first time Shamsheer and Monica pitched to me that story, I was very interested because I never heard about the story about these Dalits. So this is why it is important to work with the local journalists and to understand better about the impact of the sand mining activities around the world, because we want to hear exactly what is happening in the region. And I think like the expert to tell the story is the local journalists themselves in the region. So thanks Shamsheer and Monica for the hard work. So is Sharon here? So the other speaker is Sharon from the Science Africa that also work with us. She report from Kenya. Is Sharon here? No Sharon, right? So I think I wanted to give like a little bit background, but you can read in our website beneath the sun. So what we found in Kenya, so we have like one report from Kenya, the only representative from the Africa continent. So we sent like Sharons to village nearby Lake Victoria. So it called like Homa by Kanti. So their farmland have been turned into sand mining site that threaten food security. So I think like what I read from the article, like there is no alternative livelihoods there. So whether you're fishing or like farming, and then sand mining, you can earn more money to join this sand mining business. For people in Homagap Bay County, where the region have like a higher poverty rate than the other regions in Kenya, it's a promising, and it's like a quick money. So most of them turn their farmland to like sand mining, sand harvesting sites. Okay, I think I want to go back to maybe like Nabilah. So what is like the biggest challenge to, like in general, all of you, like covering environmental impact or reclamation? What is your biggest challenge to report on this story? You can tell like maybe it's very hard to find the data, or maybe the problem with the government transparency, or even your safety. Maybe we can start from Nabilah, and then Paritta and Lam, and then Krisna and Shamsheer.
Yeah, I think the first difficulty, and I'm not sure if everyone felt this as well, is when it comes to the trade data, there's really only one source I feel that everyone goes to again and again, and that's the UN trade data. And so for me, it was like just looking at that one source and interrogating it and being like, what new things can we say about it? Because a lot of times the trade data is it's very inert. And it's like, what story can come out of hard numbers? Because the numbers kind of don't really change that much, actually, when it comes to Singapore, especially. And at the same time, with the numbers, you also are like relying on the fact that, you know, governments are usually the ones that are reporting these numbers as well. So it's kind of like really one source. And when you're trying to compare the numbers, you're comparing like essentially one government's way of counting with another government's way of counting. So it's like that was one of the difficulties that I found. I think the other difficulty is that like at the end of the day, we all kind of have a similar call to action, which is like we need more monitoring, it needs to be regulated. But then actually what's missing is like the political will, or like how can countries come together to agree. And I think that's the missing link of like, actually, how do we get, you know, countries to come to the table and agree? And I kept going back to thinking about like the climate emergency and how, you know, that's kind of sort of changed in the last few years in thinking about how to get countries to come together to agree to large kind of like promises to, you know, like descale growth and things like that. And I'm like, how can we do the same with sand? And I think actually for me, it's still a big question mark, and it's still about like, yeah, we know what we need to do, but how, the how is the difficult part. So even after, you know, like hearing like all the amazing stories that my fellow like reporters here have been saying about the stories that they've uncovered, we're like, okay, but how, what's the next step? And I think that's a big difficulty that I found. Yeah.
Okay, Paritta and Lam, maybe you can continue.
Yeah, actually, our challenge is similar to what Nabilah mentioned about the access to data. You know, because even like our reporters try to look for the data of the volume of sand mining from the local authorities, it's also very difficult. I mean, you know, like I think in the case of Vietnam, it's available, but it's not easy to access. Or in the case of Cambodia, I think the government has like the rough data, but journalists wouldn't be able to get it, unless they just interview the minister and ask for the number. So most of the data they get is based on the interview. And also the data is kind of scattering around, if you look for the data for the demand of sand, for example, the use of sand and the volume of sand dredging is kind of scattered around, like you have to pick it up from different research. It's not in one place. And that even make thing a little bit more difficult for us to really prove, whether there are any sands being left or even sand being exported outside the country, right now. And another challenge would be, I would say, the influence of some powerful people. I guess many of you might know that, the governance system in the Mekong region countries is not quite good. There's still like high corruption. And for example, in the case of Cambodia, the company that dredged sand in the Mekong River, some of them have a tie to the government, or to some military, and it is not easy for journalists to just, report on these companies because it's gonna put them at risk. And in the meantime, like Cambodia is like one of the country that is quite dangerous for environmental reporter or environmentalists. So that's kind of prevent the journalists to go, deeper in terms of, the governance or the corruption behind the sand mining industry. And I think that's pretty much everything. Lam, you got anything to say?
So just to follow up on obtaining the data on sand mining, like even when our reporter Duyen managed to get data, he had to basically go to each individual province to ask. So that's like going around like nearly 10 provinces to ask for like the data. And when they do provide him with the data, then each province uses like a different format, and basically there's no like common like format or like to like show the data, and they collect it in different ways. And then there's a question of how do you consolidate that? And so so there were like issues with that kind of stuff, and then there are issues of data not being updated. And of course, given the size of illegal sand mining in Vietnam and other Mekong countries, I mean, this data is, of course, does not reflect the reality. And it's safe to assume that the scale of extraction is definitely much larger than the official data says. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paritta and Lam. I just want to give a comment on the local reporter. His name is Dean, that worked with Mekong Eye. So the main reason why we contacted Mekong Eye at that time, because Ian Yi, our executive director, and I look at this article published in a Mekong Eye, written by Dean. So we were very impressed because, wow, this is like a very comprehensive report from the Vietnam. And then we contacted the editor, and then we had a meeting, and we just knew that Dean, he doesn't really speak English, which is like a very, we make us like more impressed, because look at this, like some of these like talented local journalists, they don't speak English, but they can report story like this. So I think like I'm very grateful that Dean joined us in our global collaboration. So okay, so that's just a comment. I'm still impressed with him until to this day. So thank you, Lam, for helping him. So I think we move to Krisna in Indonesia. What is your biggest challenge to report this story from Indonesia?
Yeah, obviously it's the same pain points as everyone. Data, it's weird. I don't know why it's such a strange thing that they don't track sand, even though it's like such a big import-export industry. I'm just gonna leave with. I'm just gonna put the sand with like a funny story when I was like researching reclamation, which was I mentioned 3 big reclamation projects around the world. Um, it those 3, to get the number of sand that they used, I had to actually go to the Danish parliament. Kind of, they keep track of their questions from their constituents. I had to go there, translate what each person said, each person's questions from Danish to English, to get the Danish parliament saying that like, oh, we're gonna, I think, import around, what was it, 40 million cubic sand, cubic meters of sand. So only to get that one figure, I had to like trawl through that kind of. So it's the same as like what Lam said. It's such a strange thing that the data is incomplete for such a huge resource. But for Indonesia specifically, it's in. I said before about the kind of the things where the regulation is there to protect sand mines. One of the challenges for reporting in the area is actually how fast things move, because the regulations for protection is there, but it's kind of being bandied around between 2 ministries. So it's kind of like in that legal gray area, right? So so it became kind of a challenge for us, because we would identify a mining area. So I think it started, this project started, I think, last year, right? Like mid last year, I want to say. Yeah. The BTS started then. And then when I pitched the story to Febriana, I was like, yeah, we have these like 3 islands that we found, and you know, it's going on right now. I could go to the field right now and we can, you know, get all sorts of interesting stuff. And then when we eventually got there, they were done. You know, like the local people had demonstrated, because you know, their livelihoods were at stake, and it had this entire saga that we missed because things just moved around like really quickly. Like I think we were off by like a month, and then when we got there, they were like, yeah, no, it's closed. We had like a huge demonstration, and then the people from the environmental agency came by, and then they said like, we had no idea this place existed, right? And then the governor said to the minister like, oh, please take away the permit for this. So that's kind of like the challenge for us, is to recontextualize something that had already happened. So what we found after that was that the permit wasn't actually taken by the government. So the governor had asked the minister, but that power had been given back to the governor through like a weird presidential order a couple of months before. So that kind of recontextualizes the entire kind of saga, because it became from a thing that ended into a thing that may happen again in the future once things have died down, right? So yeah, that was also kind of like why we had like 3 meetings, I think, right, February, about like publishing, and then you were kind of still kind of like, oh, do other people need time? And I was like, if this is gonna get pushed again, I need to go back to Riyadh. Like, I need to go. Because at that point there was kind of rumors that the big dredging ships have come back. So I was like, yeah, I would need to go back. So that was like the big challenge. I think that's separate from all the data stuff, is just things just move really quick in terms of sand. Maybe because it's super shady, but I don't know.
Yeah, thank you, Krisna. So what about you, Nabilah? Before we move to Shamsheer, let's hear Nabilah's story.
Oh, I already answered.
Yeah, sorry, I apologize.
No worries.
Okay,
Yeah.
we move to Shamsheer. Shamsheer, what is your biggest challenge reporting the story of the sand mafia in India, in the state of Bihar?
Thanks, Febriana. Yeah, I mean, like everybody else was talking about, data was sort of a huge challenge for us too. And in particular, you know, in India, we have a law the Freedom of Information Act, the equivalent to that. And what happens in India and in particularly in Bihar is that if you do go file, on these sort of controversial topics, requests for information, it's very likely that you can be, killed. And we met an environmentalist actually, who was telling us that don't go and apply for this information because we are very likely to be sort of targeted for especially around sand mining. The other thing, of course, was safety. I think was sort of our biggest challenge. We were very apprehensive when we went there because these are areas of gunshots being fired across sand mining sites regularly. And we were a little apprehensive about going there. I mean, initially we just walked around with people, with the local people, with political parties who were sort of opposing the sand mining. And later, when we started getting a little more confident, we would take out a camera and start shooting, a few pictures and video rolls. And what happened is once somebody told us that from the distance it looks like we are carrying a gun. And so yeah, we were apprehensive, but I think we sort of managed to negotiate that pretty well. Yeah, that and I think data, those are two biggest challenges.
Okay, thank you, Shamsheer. So I think I want to invite everyone here if you have any questions. So Fiona, you are here. Do you want to ask any questions? Fiona is our global editor that help us to edit the environmental impact angle. Do you want to ask question or another audience? Tanvi, Sharon?
Hi everyone. Thanks, Febriana. I don't have any questions because I feel that I've been reading a lot on this topic in editing it. But I did want to say congratulations to you all. You did a fabulous job. And yeah, I mean, I hope that it has some of the impacts that Nabilah mentioned, take it forward. Don't just make it a story. I mean, I know that that's not always immediately obvious, the impacts of the investigations you do. But if you keep your eye on developments in that area, after a period of time, you start noticing, oh, well, that's changed, or this person said that, or there may be a law that comes into place, or sometimes it can take many years. So don't lose track on this particular aspect and this particular area of environmental coverage. And just again, congratulations to you all. You did a wonderful job, and Febriana, particularly you, in pulling it all together. Well done.
Thank you, Fiona. Also, thank you for your hard work to edit all that story. We are so grateful to have you as our global editor. And here I'm just like a facilitator for everyone. Yeah, I think talking about the impact. So as we promised that we are not going to stop here. So that's why we have this discussion. Even after like 2 weeks, we publish the story. We believe that it will make an impact. So and also just a little bit a sneak peek and a clue here for the next event in our in this series of discussion, that we actually plans to publish a follow-up story. So this is good news for everyone, our collaborator, and also everyone who watched this YouTube live streams, even after the live stream ended later. So we are not going to stop here. So for the whole year, we are going to keep publishing the follow-up story on this sand mining. And also we have talked with the UNEP actually because we heard that they are going to have this global summit with the government and stakeholder and talk about the global sand mining, because actually the first institution report this story is UNEP itself, and hopefully there are more research on the sand mining and more journalists report on this story. So we also plan, so this is not official announcement, but we also plan to give like a grant to journalists around the globe who wants to report story on the sand mining, but the official launch will be held in June 1st in our global conference. So you have to attend that event. So I think like that's, I want just to give a clue, but if you want to or sneak peek, but you want to know the detail, you can attend our global conference in June 1st, and you can find out more about that information later. So I think like this is like the last question for everyone. I think there are no question. Ade, do you think that we have question from social media or YouTube audience?
No, no, so far. There is
Okay.
no question.
Yeah, okay. So I think like when we mentioned about impact and a follow-up story, I want to hear from everyone here. Everyone here who is here can give their opinion. What is like the follow-up story that you think we need to publish in the future, especially the whole year? So anyone, each of you can raise your hand. Like some of you already mentioned. I want to hear from each of you. What is like if you imagine that like next month we are going to start working on a new story on sand mining, but it doesn't have like tight schedule like our global collaboration. So you have like this freedom of a timeline to publish this story. So what is like actually the story that the follow-up story that you want to publish? I think I want to ask Shamsheer first. What is like actually, you know, the story about sand mining is always connected or related, associated with India. So I want to hear like, what is like the other story that we need to publish from India, Shamsheer?
Right. The other story from, I mean, of course, we have only sort of tackled a very small portion of sand mining in one state in India. India has about 25 states. So there is a wide variety of stories. One that we, which we had pitched earlier also, I think we wanted to look at sort of the impact on wildlife the impact of sand mining on wildlife. I mean, particularly in these parts of India, which features some very endangered species like the Ganges dolphins, which are almost on the verge of extinction. And sand mining completely destroys their habitats. They usually thrive in these areas, and the sand mining has really destroyed their habitats in these regions. The other story that I'm particularly interested in as a follow-up is there are a lot of victims of sand mining who have been laborers from lower castes who have been murdered in these gang wars. And one of the things that we try to do during reporting for this story was to find the families of these victims, but a lot of them were very afraid to come forward and talk to us. And that is something that I'm looking to do it as a sort of a long-term project, to find these victims, the families of people who have been murdered in these gang wars, and get them to come and tell us their stories, to hear firsthand from them, because we sort of hear ancillary reports from the media, from the police, that firings have happened, people have been killed, and they have been buried in these sand mining pits, and their bodies have not been recovered, but we do not hear from their families. And that's sort of because there's there's a lot of fear among these communities that if they speak up, they will again be targeted by the sand mafia. So that's sort of what, I'm looking next.
Okay, Shamsheer, I want to hear from Nabilah Said, Continentalist. What do you think, like the story, a follow-up story from Singapore on this topic?
Something that I heard, I didn't really follow up on it, was how like with imported sand, you actually, like the sand that you get isn't like, it has history, right? And apparently some of them come with like seeds or even like, you know, like traces of like life in terms of like plant life. I don't know whether there's like animal life. I'm not really sure like what conditions are required before sand is fit for importing. But apparently like there are plants in Singapore that are growing that actually like isn't native to Singapore, and it comes from like that trajectory of like the trading of sand. And I found that very fascinating. And apparently there's like some people in Singapore, and in fact, I think the National Environmental Agency, like they track it for, you know, they track it because of like environmental purposes, but it actually is kind of implicated in like the movement of sand. So maybe that, I think that could be interesting to trace that migration of like plant life that comes with sand.
Yeah, in the other side, we destroy a habitat, but also like we move like another habitat in Singapore. That's very dilemmatic, but also like it's good that's the environmental body there doing research on that. Okay, I think I want to hear from Paritta and Lam. From Mekong regions, what kind of a follow-up story do you think is very important to be published in the future?
Yeah, so actually I and Lam discussed a lot about doing the solution story. But actually first we planned to do that, but we didn't get there because we don't have enough information. So, you know, in our context, because there are still disparity among our population, and you know, like people gonna need concrete house, you know, not living in the shacks, right? And people still need road because they want to access hospital and school, something like that. And I guess we don't really have much conversation about how we could, like, you know, still building, you know, but not cause much environmental impact, you know. And another thing is that our reporters try to interview people to find out the alternative for sand. But it seems like this conversation has not built up, you know, the narrative yet in our region. That's why we struggle a little bit. And also there's an issue of if the alternative is available, why it couldn't access the market, what prevented, you know. Are there any particular regulation, any, you know, invisible hands that, you know, prevent this alternative to be able to spread in the market? I guess that would be something that personally I would be interested that because we have a lot of sand mining story already, you know, in the Mekong region, but none of them like offer the solution of what we could do next. Yeah, Ram, you wanna add anything?
In Vietnam, the conversation around solution has been quite lively in local media in like the last 6 months or so. Our reporter Tuyen, he also wants to like follow up with that topic, and hopefully we'll see something come out of it soon.
Okay, thank you. That's a good news. Krisna, do you want to add?
Yeah, when we were trying to do the environmental impact story, we heard that there is a database somewhere that the Ministry of resources have that kind of puts the spots for all sand mines in the country, that's legal. Possibly would want to do, but would want to chase that up. If you've ever kind of, chased data up in Indonesia through ministries, it's quite impossible, even though there's like a long time frame. So would love to kind of chase that rumor up and then compare with the findings from local NGOs, kind of just create a database of sand mining sources in Indonesia, kind of see where our sand ends up. We've heard that the Rupat Island location is being used for China, Singapore, and Hong Kong, but we haven't had we couldn't verify manifests like fishermen seas, cargo ships going to and from the mine itself, but we just couldn't find the time to verify. So we'd probably seek to kind of create something as wide ranging as that. If we don't have huge time constraints and more people.
Okay, thank you, Krisna. So I myself, I can share also. So I myself, if I have to do a follow-up story, I want to know what happens to the community that we report the story. Like for example, with the fishermen in Poyang Lake, fishermen in and this like the development story of the Chinese dredging ship extracts sand in the Taiwan Shoal, for example. And then what happened with the Dalits in India after we report the story, or like the other community. I personally want to want to hear what is happening with them after we report the story. So I think that's it. Okay, so I think that's it from our discussion. Anyone want to add something before I close this discussion with some information for our next discussion and about the global company? Anyone want to add? No one want to add? Okay, so thank you very much for all the speakers here. So anyone who is not attending this this discussion, don't worry, because we're going to put it on YouTube so everyone can access it. So I just want to remind you, we have the two discussions that will be held next week. So first is woman against the Korean. So it's a story about a woman in Asia and Africa, across Asia and Africa, that we report. So it will be on May 22nd.
Sorry.
At 4 p.m.
Sorry, Febri, there is a question from YouTube.
Okay.
Okay. Ten Jolim, thank you so much for this insightful discussion. Are there resonances or differences between the sites of sand mining, like island, farmlands, and riverbanks? Have there been writing comparing them? And then, yeah.
Sorry, can you just put the equation in our chat, because it's not clear for me.
You want me to repeat the question?
No, put the question in our chat so I can see what is actually the question, because it's not clear when you say.
Wait, okay, wait.
Yeah, Ade? Thank you so much for this insightful discussion. Are there resonance or difference between the size of sand mining, like islands, farmlands, and river banks? Have there been writing comparing them? So maybe anyone wants to answer the question here? Krisna, and then
Sure.
Paritta and Shamsheer. Okay, Krisna.
Yeah, I'll go. In regards to islands, so the overlying effect, the underlying effect is the same. Sand mining would cause several environmental effects, one of which is abrasion. Speaking from our reporting in Indonesia, in terms of islands, the kind of, I don't want to say minimum, because that's like, this minimizes the entire problem. But I think at the least amount of effect would be abrasions in the coastline. You know, there year on year, the coastline would kind of go smaller and smaller. The maximum effect is that the islands would completely disappear, which is what happened to several islands in Indonesia in kind of the early 2000s because of unregulated sand mining. So that's kind of like the major difference, right? The islands would just be, if you're like an outer island with like a small kind of area, you'd just be gone. So anyone else would wanna, for riverbanks and farmland?
Okay. How about Paritta and Lam? Do you think that are there resonance or difference between the site of sand mining, like islands, farmland, and riverbanks?
Actually, I'm not quite sure what to answer here. So our coverage focus a lot on riverbanks. So it's hard for us to compare at this point.
Okay. Lam, do you have anything that you want to share about the resonance of the difference?
No, I don't have.
Okay, I think we need to interview the expert. We cannot answer that question. Okay, maybe Shamsheer, do you have like anything you want to share about this resonance of the difference?
The only thing to add, I mean, I would talk about is in the case of India specifically, marine sand mining is largely for mining rare earth materials, whereas river sand mining or farm sand mining is primarily for construction sand. That's sort of the main difference. And we in India specifically, again, I mean, which is what I can talk about. It largely is only a certain coastal areas. I mean, it's not a very big problem in India so far, but river sand mining is a huge issue in our country, and and there it's construction, building construction that's sort of driving that mining.
Okay, I hope that it answered your question, Jolene. I think like that can be like a follow-up story. If anyone wants to look at that, I think it's like a data scientist journalist. Data and a science journalist can work on that because it's very specific. I personally, I don't think I have any knowledge about that. Okay, I hope that answered the question. Okay, so Ade, do we have any question from social media and YouTube?
No.
Yeah,
That's about it.
Are you sure? No question, right? Okay, thank you. Again, I just want to remind you, we have 2 more discussions. First is a woman against the grain. If you want to hear a story from our reporter from India, Kenya, and Indonesia, how they cover the story of this woman against the this woman resistance against the powerful sand mining company in this country. You can come to our discussion on May 22nd. So it's next week at the same time, 4 p.m. Kuala Lumpur times. And then we also have the story about the story about the crime, the drug story, I think, the crime and the story about the crime around the sand mining business. We cannot run away. So it will be held on May 25, 2023. So 3 days after the gender angle events. It at the same time, 4 p.m. Kuala Lumpur time, and the speakers will be Monica Ja from India and Carol Ilagan from the Philippines. Carol, you are here. Can you explain a little bit, like sneak peek about the discussion on the crime angle? Hi, Carol. You're okay. I think Carol is busy. Okay, so if you're curious about that, you can just subscribe to our newsletter or follow our social media on Instagram, on Twitter and Facebook, and we will update you about the event. Okay, thank you everyone, and see you in the next discussion next week.
Thank you, you too, Febi, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay.
guys. See you later.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Okay, thanks everyone.